The day they put Sophia Bennett up for auction like cattle in the dusty streets of Millbrook, Colorado Territory, nobody could have imagined that the silent Lakota warrior watching from the shadows would transform her from the town's greatest shame into a queen among his people. The sun beat down mercilessly on the ramshackle frontier town of Millbrook, where hope came to die and dreams turned to dust in the unforgiving Colorado wind. The town squatted in a valley between barren hills, its wooden buildings weathered, gray by constant sun and occasional flash floods that turned Main Street into a river of mud. Millbrook existed for one reason: the silver mine that burrowed deep into the mountainside like a hungry beast. The mine brought men seeking fortune, and men brought the inevitable collection of saloons, gambling houses, and the kind of rough justice that came from the barrel of a gun rather than the pages of a law book.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The population swelled to nearly 800 souls during the boom months, but it was a transient crowd. Men came to get rich quick, and when the silver played out or their luck ran dry, they moved on to the next strike, leaving behind only the sturdy few who had put down roots deep enough to survive the Colorado winters. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with the essential businesses that kept frontier life functioning. Murphy's General Store, with its creaking wooden floors and shelves stocked with everything from horseshoe nails to laudanum. The Silver Dollar Saloon, where miners spent their wages on rot-gut whiskey and poker games that lasted until dawn. Doc Henley's medical office, where more men died than lived. And the Frontier Bank, where fortunes were made and lost with equal frequency. The church sat at the end of Main Street, a modest wooden structure with a bell tower that rarely rang for anything but funerals. Pastor Williams preached fire and brimstone to a congregation that included more sinners than saints. But in a town where death came easily and often, even the hardest men sought some comfort in the promise of redemption. At the center of town stood the courthouse, a 2-story brick building that served as the seat of territorial justice. It was here that disputes were settled, claims were filed. And on this particular September morning, where human beings were sold to pay their debts, the people of Millbrook were a mixture of dreamers and desperados, failed farmers and successful merchants, women who had followed their men west and found themselves widowed before 30, and children who grew up too fast in a world where childhood was a luxury few could afford. But beneath the veneer of civilization, Millbrook operated on the harsh mathematics of survival. If you couldn't pay your debts, you lost everything. If you couldn't defend yourself, you died. And if you were a woman without a man's protection, you became property to be traded like any other commodity. The territorial law was clear and brutal. Debts must be paid, and if you had no money, you paid with your labor. The debtors' auction was held the first Monday of every month, where those who owed more than they could pay were sold into indentured servitude until their obligations were satisfied. It was a system that kept the wheels of commerce turning in a place where cash was scarce and credit was everything. But it was also a system that could destroy lives with the stroke of a pen and the fall of an auctioneer's hammer. On this particular September morning, as the sun climbed higher and the crowd gathered in the dusty courthouse square, all eyes were fixed on the wooden platform where the monthly auction would take place. But today's auction was different. Today, for the first time in Millbrook's brief history, a woman stood among the debtors waiting to be sold. Sophia Bennett was 23 years old, though the hardships of frontier life had etched lines around her green eyes that made her look older. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely under a faded bonnet, and her simple gray dress, though clean and carefully mended, spoke of poverty that had lasted too long. Sophie had been married to Jacob Bennett, a dreamer who believed he could strike it rich in the silver mines. Jacob had been a kind man, gentle and optimistic. But he possessed the fatal flaw of many frontier settlers. He confused hope with planning. He had borrowed heavily to purchase mining equipment, convinced that the next shaft would yield the fortune that would make them wealthy beyond measure. But the silver had played out, and Jacob had died in a mine collapse 6 months ago. Crushed beneath tons of rock and timber in the very tunnel he had sworn would make their fortune. The mine owner, Harrison Blackwood, had offered a token payment to the widow, but it wasn't enough to cover even a fraction of Jacob's debts. Sophie had tried everything to keep her head above water. She had sold their few possessions, taken in laundry, worked as a seamstress, and even cleaned the floors of the Silver Dollar Saloon after hours. But the interest on Jacob's loans compounded faster than she could earn money, and the creditors grew impatient. The final blow came when Doc Henley demanded payment for the medical care he had provided during Jacob's final days. Sophie had begged for more time, but the doctor, a cold man who viewed compassion as a luxury he couldn't afford, had gone to the territorial judge and demanded satisfaction. Judge Augustus Crane was a man who believed in the letter of the law above all else. He had seen frontier towns collapse when debts went unpaid, and he was determined that Millbrook would not suffer the same fate. When Sophie appeared before him, unable to pay the $300 she owed, he had no choice but to order her sold at auction. But Sophie's situation was complicated by a factor that made her even more unmarketable than her poverty. She was believed to be barren. In 3 years of marriage to Jacob, she had never conceived a child. In a frontier society where women were valued primarily for their ability to bear children and manage households, a barren woman was considered damaged goods. The whispers had started within months of her marriage. Something wrong with that Bennett woman, the matrons would say. 3 years married and not even a miscarriage to show for it. The speculation grew crueler as time passed, with some suggesting that Sophie was cursed, others that she was being punished by God for some secret sin. Mrs. Abigail Worthington, the banker's wife and the unofficial social leader of Millbrook's respectable women, had been particularly vocal in her condemnation. A woman who cannot fulfill her basic function is hardly a woman at all, she had declared at a church social. Poor Jacob Bennett tied himself to damaged goods. The cruel irony was that Sophie had desperately wanted children. She had prayed nightly for a child, had visited Doc Henley repeatedly seeking advice, and had even consulted with Maria Santos, the Mexican woman who served as the town's unofficial midwife and healer. But month after month, year after year, her prayers went unanswered. Now, as she stood on the auction platform, Sophie knew that her reputation for barrenness would make her even less valuable to potential buyers. A man might purchase her services for cooking, cleaning, or other domestic work, but he would never expect her to provide the children that frontier families needed to survive. The crowd that gathered in the courthouse square was a mixture of curiosity seekers and serious bidders. Ezra Holt, the town's auctioneer, was a thin man with a voice like a rusty gate who had conducted dozens of these sales over the years. He knew how to read a crowd, how to build excitement, and how to squeeze every last dollar from reluctant bidders. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holt called out, his voice carrying across the square, "we have here today the monthly sale of debtors as authorized by territorial law. First up, we have Mrs. Sophia Bennett, widow of the late Jacob Bennett. She owes the sum of $300 to various creditors, and her labor is to be sold until such time as the debt is satisfied." The crowd murmured as Sophie stepped forward. She kept her head high, her spine straight, refusing to give the townspeople the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She had endured 6 months of whispered insults and pitying looks, and she would endure this final humiliation with whatever dignity she could muster. "Now Mrs. Bennett is a capable woman," Holt continued, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as the crowd. "She can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household. She's young, healthy, and has been properly instructed in the domestic arts. But can she breed?" called out Tom Morrison, a rancher who was known for his crude sense of humor. The crowd laughed, and Sophie felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That's not relevant to the auction," Holt replied, though his discomfort was obvious. We're selling.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Her labor, not her other services. Hell, it's relevant to me, Morrison shot back. I need a woman who can give me sons, not just cook my meals. 3 years married and nothing to show for it. What good is a barren woman on a ranch? The laughter grew louder, and Sophie felt something die inside her chest. She had known this moment would come, had prepared herself for it. But the reality of being discussed like a defective piece of livestock was worse than she had imagined. Let's start the bidding at $50, Holt announced, trying to regain control of the proceedings. Silence fell over the crowd. $50 was a significant sum, but it was also far below what a healthy woman's labor should command. The silence stretched on, broken only by the shuffling of feet and the whispered conversations of the spectators. Come now, gentlemen, Holt pressed. Surely someone can use a capable housekeeper. Mrs. Bennett comes highly recommended. By who? Called out Samuel Porter, the blacksmith. Name one person who'll vouch for her. Holt looked around. The crowd, searching for a friendly face, but found none. The respectable women of Millbrook had made their opinions of Sophie clear. And the men were hesitant to bid on a woman who carried such a stigma. $30, Holt tried again, his voice less confident now, still no response. Sophie felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She was worth less than a decent horse, less than a plow, less than the simplest farm equipment. The crowd was enjoying her degradation, feeding on her shame like vultures on carrion. $20, Holt said desperately. Surely someone can use. I'll give you. $10, called out Jake Miller, a saloon owner with a reputation for mistreating his employees. And that's only because I need someone to scrub floors and empty spittoons. The crowd laughed again, but this time there was an ugly edge to the sound. Sophie knew Miller's reputation, knew what kind of work he was really offering. She would rather die than submit to that kind of degradation. $10, Holt repeated, though he looked sick. Do I hear 15? The silence was deafening. Sophie stood on the platform, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. Each gaze a judgment, each whisper a condemnation. She was about to be sold to Jake Miller for $10, the price of a bottle of good whiskey. Then, from the back of the crowd, came a voice that cut through the murmuring like a blade. I offer 2 horses. The crowd turned as one to locate the source of the voice. Standing at the edge of the square, partially hidden in the shadow of Murphy's General Store, was a man unlike any other in Millbrook. Black Elk stood over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and lean build of a natural warrior. His long black hair was braided with leather and feathers, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to see through the crowd to something deeper. He wore traditional Lakota clothing, a buckskin shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, leather leggings, and moccasins that had allowed him to approach the square in complete silence. But it wasn't his appearance that stunned the crowd into silence. It was the fact that he was there at all. Lakota warriors didn't come to Millbrook. The two peoples existed in an uneasy peace, separated by an invisible boundary that both sides respected. For a Lakota to appear in the town square during an auction was unprecedented. Did he just say 2 horses? Whispered Mrs. Worthington, her voice filled with disbelief. Black Elk stepped forward, his movements fluid and confident. Behind him, partially concealed by the buildings, Sophie could see other figures, children, she realized, 4. Young faces peering around the corner with curiosity and caution. I offer 2 horses. Black Elk repeated, his English accented but clear. Both strong, both healthy, worth more than $10? The crowd was speechless. In frontier economics, horses were valuable beyond measure. A good horse could mean the difference between life and death, between prosperity and poverty. 2 horses represented wealth that few men in Millbrook could match. Judge Crane pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with confusion and anger. Now see here, he sputtered. This is highly irregular. We don't, that is, the law doesn't The law says debts must be paid. Black Elk interrupted, his voice calm but firm. I offer payment. 2 horses for the woman's debt. But Crane began, then stopped himself. Even in 1876 Colorado territory, there were limits to what a judge could say publicly. This is a legal proceeding conducted under territorial law. I'm not sure if the law applies to all people, Black Elk said simply, or it applies to none. The crowd murmured uncertainly. They had come expecting entertainment, a chance to see the proud Sophia Bennett brought low. Instead, they were witnessing something unprecedented. A Lakota warrior offering to pay a white woman's debts. With his own property, auctioneer Holt looked desperately at Judge Crane, seeking guidance. The judge, in turn, looked at the crowd, trying to gauge their reaction. The situation was unlike anything in his experience, and he was clearly out of his depth. The bid is 2 horses, Holt announced finally, his voice uncertain. Do I hear? This is outrageous, Mrs. Worthington declared, her voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. You can't sell a white woman to him. It's not decent. It's not Christian. The law is the law, Abigail, Judge Crane replied, though his discomfort was obvious. If no one else wishes to bid, I bid $15. Jake Miller called out, his voice angry. He had been looking forward to acquiring Sophie's services, and he wasn't about to be outbid by an Indian. Black Elk reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that made the crowd gasp. It was a nugget of gold, roughly the size of a man's thumb, gleaming in the afternoon sun. I had this, he said simply, placing the nugget on the platform at Sophie's feet. The crowd fell silent. That much gold was worth more than most men in Millbrook earned in a year. Combined with the 2 horses, Black Elk's offer was beyond anything anyone else could match. This is insane, Miller protested. You can't let him. The bidding stands at 2 horses and a gold nugget, Holt announced, his voice stronger. Now, money was money, regardless of its source, and he was beginning to see the profit in this unusual transaction. Do I hear any other offers? The crowd was silent. No one in Millbrook had the resources to match Black Elk's bid, and they all knew it. Sophie stood on the platform, staring down at the gold nugget at her feet, trying to process what was happening. Going once. Holt called out, going twice. Sold to the gentleman for 2 horses and gold. The hammer fell with a sound like thunder. Sophie Bennett, the woman Millbrook had deemed worthless, had just been purchased by a Lakota warrior for a price that exceeded the annual earnings of most men in the territory. But as the crowd began to disperse, muttering angrily among themselves, Sophie realized that her ordeal was far from over. She had been saved from Jake Miller's clutches, but she had no idea what fate awaited her in the world beyond Millbrook's borders. Black Elk approached the platform, his dark eyes meeting hers for the first time. In his gaze, she saw not the cruelty she had expected, but something else entirely, compassion, understanding, and perhaps, though she dared not hope, the possibility of a new beginning. Come, he said simply, extending his hand toward her. We go home. Sophie looked at his outstretched hand, then at the crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness her humiliation. She thought of the life she was leaving behind, the debts that had been paid, the shame that had been lifted from her shoulders. Then, without a word, she took his hand and stepped down from the platform. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. As they walked toward the edge of town, the 4 children emerged from their hiding place and fell into step behind them. Sophie glanced back once at Millbrook, at the life she had known, then turned her face toward the horizon and whatever future awaited her in the world beyond. The dust of Millbrook settled behind them as Black Elk led Sophie and the 4 children away from the only life she had ever known. The Lakota warrior moved with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged to the land itself, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth, while Sophie's worn boots seemed to announce every step to the wilderness around them. The children followed in a loose formation that spoke of long practice and natural discipline. The eldest, a boy of perhaps 12 summers with serious dark eyes and the beginnings of his father's strong jaw, kept pace beside Black Elk with the easy stride of someone accustomed to long journeys. Behind him came two girls, twins by their appearance, maybe 9 years old, their long black hair braided with small beads that caught the afternoon light. The youngest, a boy of perhaps 6, brought up the rear with the determined gait of a child trying to match the adult's pace. Sophie walked beside Black Elk, acutely aware of the strange turn her life had taken in the space of a single afternoon. This morning she had awakened in her tiny rented room above the seamstress shop, resigned to a fate that would have destroyed whatever remained of her dignity. Now she found herself traveling into the unknown with a man whose language she didn't speak and whose intentions she couldn't fathom. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the tall grass and the distant call of a hawk circling high above. Sophie had always been comfortable with quiet, but this silence felt different. It wasn't the oppressive quiet of disapproval that had surrounded her in Millbrook, but something deeper, a waiting silence as if the land itself was holding its breath to see what would unfold. After an hour of walking, Black Elk raised his hand and the small procession came to a halt. Without a word, he whistled softly, a sound that seemed to blend with the natural chorus of the prairie. Moments later, 5 horses emerged from a stand of cottonwoods near a small creek, their coats gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The horses were magnificent. 2 were the animals Black Elk had offered in trade, a painted stallion with white and brown markings that spoke of careful breeding, and a gray mare whose intelligent eyes and graceful build marked her as a prized possession. The other 3 were clearly the children's mounts, smaller but no less beautiful. Each one perfectly matched to its young rider. Sophie had grown up around horses, but these animals were different from the sturdy workhorses she had known in Millbrook. These were war horses, trained for speed and endurance. Their connection to their riders so complete that they seemed to communicate through subtle shifts in weight and barely perceptible signals. Black Elk approached the gray mare and spoke to her in his own language, his voice gentle and melodious. The horse nickered softly in response, nuzzling his shoulder with obvious affection. He turned to Sophie and gestured toward the painted stallion. "You ride Thunder Walker," he said in English, his accent lending a musical quality to the words. "He is strong but gentle. He will carry you safely." Sophie approached the stallion cautiously, her hand extended. The horse regarded her with calm brown eyes, then lowered his head to sniff her palm. Something in his manner reminded her of Jacob's old plow horse, and she felt a small measure of her tension ease. "I haven't ridden in some time," she admitted, running her hand along Thunder Walker's neck. "Jacob sold our horses to pay debts." Black Elk nodded, understanding. More than just her words, he had seen the poverty in her clothing, the desperate resignation in her eyes during the auction. Without comment, he helped her mount, his hands steady and respectful as he guided her foot to the stirrup. The children had already mounted their horses with the fluid ease of those born to the saddle. The eldest boy, whom Black Elk addressed as Brave Fox, sat his pony with the straight-backed pride of a young warrior. The twin girls, Morning Star and Singing Bird, chattered quietly to each other in their musical language, while their horses stood patient and alert. The youngest, Little Wolf, struggled briefly with his reins before his father quietly corrected his grip. As they prepared to depart, Sophie caught sight of Millbrook in the distance, the town's wooden buildings already looking small and insignificant against the vast backdrop of the Colorado Territory. She felt a strange mixture of fear and relief, fear of the unknown future that awaited her, but relief at leaving behind the suffocating weight of judgment and shame that had been her constant companion for so long. They rode northeast across the rolling prairie, following trails that were invisible to Sophie's eyes, but as clear as roads to Black Elk and his children. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, the scrubby vegetation of the mining country giving way to the richer grasslands that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Black Elk called a halt near a small stream bordered by willows. The children dismounted with practiced efficiency, immediately beginning the tasks of making camp with no need for instruction. Sophie watched in fascination as the small group transformed into a perfectly coordinated team. Brave Fox gathered firewood while the twins unpacked supplies from their saddlebags. Little Wolf, despite his young age, took charge of the horses with the serious concentration of someone who understood the importance of proper care. Black Elk gestured for Sophie to sit on a fallen log near where the fire would be built, then disappeared into the willows. She found herself alone with the children for the first time, acutely aware of the language barrier that separated them. Morning Star approached her shyly, carrying a leather water bag. She offered it to Sophie with a tentative smile, speaking softly in Lakota, though Sophie couldn't understand the words. The gesture was clear. "Thank you," Sophie said, accepting the water gratefully. Her voice seemed to startle the girl, who stepped back quickly, but after a moment, Morning Star ventured closer again, her curiosity overcoming her caution. The child pointed to Sophie's auburn hair, then to her own black braids, clearly fascinated by the difference. Sophie smiled and nodded, then gently touched a strand of her own hair. "Yes, it's different, isn't it?" she said softly. Singing Bird joined her twin, and soon both girls were examining Sophie with the frank curiosity of children. They touched her dress, fingered the fabric with interest, and chattered to each other in their musical language. Sophie found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. Little Wolf, having finished with the horses, approached more boldly. He pointed to himself and said something in Lakota, then looked at Sophie expectantly. When she didn't respond, he repeated the gesture, speaking more slowly. "I think you're telling me your name," Sophie said, pointing to him. "Little Wolf?" She tried, remembering what his father had called him. The boy's face lit up with delight. He nodded vigorously, then pointed to Sophie and tilted his head questioningly. She understood immediately. "Sophie," she said, pointing to herself. "My name is Sophie." "Sophie," Little Wolf repeated carefully. The unfamiliar sounds awkward on his tongue. His sisters giggled. And soon all three younger children were attempting to pronounce her name, their efforts becoming increasingly animated as they played with the foreign syllables. Only Brave Fox remained aloof, watching the interaction with a serious expression. That seemed to be his constant companion. Sophie could see wariness in his eyes, and perhaps something deeper. This child had lived long enough to understand the complexities of the world his father was bringing into their lives. Black Elk returned carrying several fat trout. His hunting having been successful, he paused at the edge of the camp, watching as Sophie interacted with his children. Something in his expression softened as he saw Little Wolf demonstrating the proper way to say Sophie to his giggling sisters. As the evening meal was prepared, Sophie found herself drawn into the rhythms of the family's life. She helped Morning Star prepare wild onions that the girl had gathered near the stream, their shared task transcending the language barrier. When Singing Bird burned her finger on a hot stone, Sophie instinctively reached out to examine the injury, her gentle touch and concerned expression communicating more than words ever could. The meal was simple but satisfying. Fresh trout, cooked over the open fire, wild onions, and a kind of flatbread that Black Elk produced from his supplies. They ate in companionable silence, the children's earlier shyness gradually giving way to acceptance. As darkness fell and the stars emerged in the vast Colorado sky, Black Elk began to speak. His voice was low and melodious, and though Sophie couldn't understand the words, she recognized the cadence of storytelling. The children listened with rapt attention, their eyes bright in the firelight. "He tells them the story of how Thunder Walker got his name," Brave Fox said suddenly, his English startling Sophie. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly. "You speak English," Sophie said, trying to keep the surprise from her voice. The boy nodded, his expression still guarded. "Father taught me. He says it is important to understand the words of those who share our land." "Will you tell me the story?" Sophie asked gently. Brave Fox was silent for a long moment, then began to translate his father's words. Long ago, before the white men came to our lands, there was a horse born during the greatest thunderstorm anyone could remember. The lightning struck the earth all around as he was born, but he was not afraid. Instead, he seemed to dance with the thunder, and when the storm passed, he could run faster than the wind itself. As Brave Fox translated, Sophie found herself drawn into the story. She could see the wild horse in her mind's eye, running across the prairie with the storm clouds rolling behind him. The tale was both magical and deeply rooted in the natural world, so different from the stern moral lessons she had learned in Millbrook's church. When the story ended, the children began to prepare for sleep. They spread their blankets near the fire, the older ones helping the younger with the easy care that spoke of long practice. Sophie sat uncertainly, unsure of what was expected of her. Black Elk approached her, carrying a bundle of soft buffalo hide. "You sleep here," he said, indicating a spot slightly apart from the family circle, but still within the warmth of the fire. "You are safe. No one will harm you." The simple declaration carried more weight than any elaborate promise. Sophie accepted the blanket, gratefully wrapping it around her shoulders. The hide was incredibly soft, far superior to any covering she had owned in Millbrook. As the fire died down to glowing embers, Sophie lay staring up at the vast expanse of stars overhead. The silence of the prairie was profound, broken only by the distant call of a coyote and the soft breathing of the sleeping children. She had never felt so small or so alone, yet paradoxically, she also felt safer than she had in months. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound. Little Wolf had awakened and was crying quietly, trying not to disturb the others. Sophie could see his small form silhouetted against the dying fire, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Without thinking, Sophie rose and moved toward the child. She knelt beside him, her hand hovering uncertainly over his shoulder. He looked up at her with tear-filled eyes, and she saw in them the universal language of a child's distress. "What's wrong, little one?" she whispered, though she knew he couldn't understand her words. Little Wolf spoke in Lakota, his voice thick with tears. Though Sophie couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. He was homesick, frightened, missing something, or someone familiar. Sophie made a decision. She gathered the little boy into her arms, holding him close as she had once dreamed of holding her own children. He stiffened at first, then gradually relaxed against her. His crying gradually subsiding, she began to hum softly, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her years ago. The melody was simple and soothing, and she felt Little Wolf's breathing gradually slow as he drifted toward sleep. She continued to hold him, rocking gently back and forth, until his breathing deepened and he slept peacefully in her arms. When she looked up, she found Black Elk watching her from across the dying fire. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes had changed. He had seen her instinctive response to his child's distress, had witnessed the gentleness that came as naturally to her as breathing. "His mother died in the winter," Black Elk said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes the pain returns like a wound that will not heal." Sophie felt her heart clench with sympathy. She looked down at the sleeping child in her arms, understanding now the source of his distress. "I'm sorry," she whispered back. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love." Black Elk nodded, his eyes reflecting the dying firelight. She was called Gentle Rain. She was like summer sunshine, always laughing, always singing. The children miss her voice. "How long?" Sophie asked softly. 7 moons, he replied. "The sickness came with the early snow. Many in our band died. The children have had no woman's care since then." Sophie felt a new understanding of the situation she had entered. This wasn't just about paying a debt or acquiring a servant. This was about a father desperately trying to heal his children's wounds, to fill a void that had been left by tragedy. She looked at the sleeping faces around the fire. Brave Fox, trying so hard to be the man his father needed him to be. The twins clinging to each other for comfort, and Little Wolf, still small enough to cry for his mother in the night. "Is that why you came to Millbrook?" she asked. "For them?" Black Elk was quiet for a long moment. "I went to trade horses for supplies. I saw the crowd, heard the words they spoke about you. I saw a woman in pain, and I thought of my children who also know pain, sometimes. The Great Spirit shows us the path we must take." Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. She had been so focused on her own shame and desperation that she hadn't considered that her rescuer might have his own reasons for the impulsive act. He hadn't saved her out of pity or desire. He had saved her because he recognized a kindred spirit, another soul damaged by loss and circumstance. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Now we go home," Black Elk replied. "Tomorrow we cross into the lands of my people. There will be questions, challenges. Not all will welcome a white woman into our band, but my children need healing, and perhaps you need a new beginning. We will face whatever comes together." Sophie looked down at little Wolf, still sleeping peacefully in her arms. For the first time in months, she felt a stirring of something she had thought lost forever. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of hope. A chance to be more than the broken woman Millbrook had judged her to be. As the last embers of the fire died away, and the prairie settled into the deep quiet of night, Sophie held the sleeping child close and allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, her story was not ending but beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her courage and character. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars, she was no longer alone. She was part of something larger than herself, part of a family that had chosen to embrace her despite the vast differences between their worlds. The journey to her new life had begun. Dawn broke over the prairie with the soft gold light that transforms the grasslands into something almost magical. Sophie woke to find little Wolf still curled against her side, his small hand clutching her dress as if afraid she might disappear. The other children were already stirring, their movements quiet and efficient as they prepared for another day of travel. Black Elk knelt by the stream, his morning prayers, a low murmur that seemed to blend with the sound of running water. Sophie watched him with growing curiosity, noting the reverence in his posture, the way he seemed to commune with the natural world around him. This was so different from the harsh, judgmental religion of Millbrook, where God was portrayed as a stern taskmaster waiting to punish the smallest transgression. As they broke camp and prepared to continue their journey, Sophie noticed a change in the landscape. The grass grew taller here, waving in the morning breeze like a green ocean. The horizon seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, making her feel both insignificant and strangely liberated. This was a land without fences, without the cramped boundaries that had defined her life in the mining town. "We crossed the sacred boundary today," Black Elk said as he helped her mount Thunder Walker. "Beyond that ridge lies the heart of our hunting grounds. It is there that my people will first see you, and there that your real journey begins." Sophie felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. She had been so focused on escaping Millbrook that she hadn't fully considered what awaited her in the Lakota world. What if Black Elk's people rejected her? What if they saw her as an intruder, a threat to their way of life? Brave Fox seemed to sense her apprehension. "The women will test you," he said matter-of-factly as they rode. "They will want to know if you are worthy of my father's protection. If you can work, if you can learn, if you can be trusted with the children." "What kind of tests?" Sophie asked, trying to keep the anxiety from her voice. The boy shrugged. "They will watch how you behave, how you treat the little ones, whether you show respect for our ways. My grandmother, wise woman, will be the hardest to convince. She believes white people bring only trouble." Sophie absorbed this information in silence. She had thought the hardest part was behind her, but now she realized that the real challenge was just beginning. She would have to prove herself worthy not just to Black Elk, but to an entire community that had no reason to trust her. As they crested a low hill, Sophie gasped at the sight before them. The prairie stretched out in all directions, a sea of grass that seemed to go on forever in the distance. She could see a dark line that she realized must be a river, marked by the cottonwoods that grew along its banks. And scattered across the landscape, like flowers in a vast garden, were dozens of teepees. The Lakota village was larger than Sophie had expected. The conical dwellings were arranged in a rough circle, their buffalo hide covers decorated. With intricate painted designs, smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could see people moving between the teepees, going about their daily tasks. "My band," Black Elk said simply, but Sophie could hear the pride in his voice. "Nearly 200 souls, we are the Oglala, the people who scatter their own. We follow the buffalo and live as our ancestors lived." As they approached the village, Sophie became aware of the attention they were attracting. Children ran alongside their horses, chattering excitedly in Lakota. Adults emerged from their teepees to stare at the unusual sight of a white woman riding with Black Elk and his family. The look she received ranged from curious to openly hostile. An older woman with silver-streaked hair and a face marked by decades of prairie wind stepped forward to block their path. She wore a dress of soft buckskin, decorated with intricate beadwork, and her bearing spoke of authority and wisdom. This, Sophie realized, must be Wise Woman. The matriarch spoke rapidly to Black Elk and Lakota, her voice sharp with disapproval. Sophie didn't need to understand the words to know she was being discussed. Wise Woman's eyes never left Sophie's face as she spoke, studying her with the intensity of a hawk evaluating potential prey. Black Elk replied calmly, his voice respectful but firm. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other villagers gathering to listen. Sophie felt like a piece of merchandise being evaluated at market, and the sensation brought back uncomfortable memories of the auction in Millbrook. Finally, Wise Woman approached Thunder Walker and looked up at Sophie. She spoke a few words in heavily accented English. "You come down, we talk." Sophie dismounted, her legs unsteady after the long ride. She found herself face with the woman who would apparently decide her fate. Wise Woman was smaller than Sophie had expected, but her presence seemed to fill the space around her. Her dark eyes were intelligent and penetrating, missing nothing. "You are the white woman my grandson bought with horses," Wise Woman said, her English slow but clear. "Why does he bring you to our people?" Sophie felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. This was clearly a test, and her answer would determine whether she was accepted or rejected. She thought of little Wolf sleeping in her arms, of the gentle way Black Elk had helped her onto her horse, of the possibility of a new beginning. "I don't know why he chose me," Sophie said honestly. "I only know that his children have lost their mother, and I have lost my home. Perhaps we can help each other heal." Wise Woman studied her for a long moment. "You have no children of your own. The people in the town, they said you were broken. Why should we trust you with our little ones?" The question hit Sophie like a physical blow. Even here, hundreds of miles from Millbrook, her reputation for barrenness had preceded her. She felt the familiar shame rising in her chest, but then she looked at little Wolf, who was watching her with wide, trusting eyes. "It's true that I never had children," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "But that doesn't mean I don't know how to love them. Last night, when little Wolf cried for his mother, I held him until he slept. I may not be able to give birth, but I can give care. I can give comfort. I can give love." Wise Woman's expression didn't change, but Sophie thought she saw something flicker in the old woman's eyes. "We will see," she said finally. "You will stay in the teepee of Laughing Water, my daughter. She will teach you our ways. If you prove worthy, you will remain. If not," she shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes. Laughing Water proved to be a woman of about 30, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded Sophie of her own mother. She led Sophie to a teepee on the edge of the village, explaining in broken English that this would be her home, while the community evaluated her. The interior of the teepee was surprisingly comfortable. Buffalo robes covered the ground, and parfleshes painted rawhide containers held the family's belongings. A fire pit in the center provided warmth, with a smoke hole at the top of the structure, allowing the smoke to escape. The whole space felt warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cramped, cold room Sophie had occupied in Millbrook. "You sleep here," Laughing Water said, indicating a space near the wall. "Tomorrow you learn. Women's work, children's needs, our ways. If you are a good student, maybe you stay." That evening, Sophie found herself in the center of what could only be described as a trial by fire. The women of the village gathered in Laughing Water's teepee, ostensibly to welcome the newcomer, but actually to evaluate her worthiness. They ranged in age from teenagers to grandmothers, and all of them seemed to have opinions about the white woman who had arrived with Black Elk. The interrogation began gently enough. Blue Bird, a young woman with a baby at her breast, asked about Sophie's domestic skills. Could she tan hides? Could she prepare pemmican? Did she know how to make medicine from prairie plants? Sophie answered honestly, admitting her ignorance of most traditional Lakota skills, but expressing her willingness to learn. Some of the women exchanged skeptical looks, but others seemed impressed by her humility. As the evening progressed, the questions became more pointed. Red Hawk Woman, an older woman with sharp features and a sharper tongue, demanded to know why Sophie had been sold at auction. What debts had she incurred? What sins had she committed? "My husband died in a mining accident," Sophie explained, her voice steady despite the pain of the memory. "I borrowed money to hire a lawyer to fight for compensation. When I lost the case, I couldn't pay the debts. In the white man's law, a person can be sold to pay what they owe." The women murmured among themselves. The concept of debt slavery was foreign to them, but they understood the loss of a husband and the desperation that followed. Several of the older women nodded with sympathy, but Red Hawk Woman wasn't finished. "The people in the town, they said you could not make babies. If this is true, what use are you to us? A woman who cannot give life is like a tree that cannot give fruit." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sophie felt the familiar shame wash over her, but this time she fought against it. She thought of little Wolf's tears, of the way Morning Star had shyly offered her water, of the trust she had seen in Black Elk's eyes. "It's true that I never carried a child," Sophie said, her voice growing stronger. "But there are many ways to nurture life. I can teach children to read and write. I can tend them when they're sick. I can hold them when they cry. Love doesn't require birth, it only requires an open heart." White Dove, a middle-aged woman who had been silent until now, spoke up. "My sister died in childbirth 5 winters ago. Her children had no mother's care. The oldest girl, only 8 summers, tried to raise the younger ones. They all died before the next spring. Sometimes a woman who cannot give birth can still give life." The comment sparked a heated discussion among the women. Some argued that a barren woman was cursed, that her presence might bring misfortune to the village. Others pointed out that many women died in childbirth, and that children needed care regardless of who provided it. Finally, Wise Woman, who had been listening in silence, raised her hand for quiet. "We will know her worth by her actions, not by her words. Tomorrow, she begins to learn. We will watch, and we will see." The next morning, Sophie woke before dawn to the sound of activity throughout the village. Women were already up, tending fires and preparing the morning meal. She dressed quickly and emerged from the teepee to find Laughing Water waiting for her. "Today, you learn to be Lakota woman," Laughing Water said with a smile. "First, we get water from river, then we prepare food, then we work on hides. Always work, always learning." Sophie followed her new teacher to the river, where a group of women were already gathered. They carried beautifully crafted water vessels made from buffalo stomachs, designed to hold large quantities of water without breaking. Sophie was given a smaller container and shown how to fill it properly. The work was harder than she had expected. The water was heavy, and the walk back to the village was uphill. By the time they reached the teepees, Sophie's shoulders ached and her hands were raw from gripping the unfamiliar container. But she had completed the task without complaint, and she noticed a few approving nods from the other women. The rest of the morning was spent preparing the communal meal. Sophie watched carefully as the women worked, trying to memorize the techniques they used. She was allowed to help with simple tasks, gathering buffalo chips for fuel, stirring the cooking pot, cutting vegetables with a sharp obsidian knife. Everything was different from what she had known. The tools, the ingredients, the methods of preparation, but the underlying rhythm of women working together, sharing tasks and conversation was familiar and comforting. Despite the language barrier, Sophie began to feel a sense of belonging that had been missing from her life in Millbrook. The afternoon brought a different kind of challenge. Sophie was introduced to the art of hide preparation, one of the most important skills a Lakota woman could possess. Strong bear woman, a robust woman with muscular arms and a no-nonsense attitude, took charge of Sophie's education. Buffalo hide must be scraped clean, Strong bear woman explained, demonstrating with a curved tool made from sharpened bone. All flesh, all fat must be removed. Hide must be soft, supple. This is how we make clothes, teepees, containers. This is survival. Sophie took the scraping tool and began to work. The task was backbreaking, requiring strength and endurance she wasn't sure she possessed. The other women worked with practiced efficiency, their movements smooth and rhythmic. Sophie's efforts were clumsy by comparison, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. But she persisted, determined to prove her worth. When her hands began to blister, she wrapped them in strips of cloth and continued working. When her back began to ache, she adjusted her position and kept scraping. The women watched her struggle, some with skepticism, others with growing respect. As the sun reached its zenith, little Wolf appeared at the edge of the work area. He had been playing with the other children, but something had upset him. His face was streaked with tears, and he looked around desperately until he spotted Sophie. Without hesitation, he ran to her and threw his arms around her waist. He spoke rapidly in Lakota, his words tumbling over each other in his distress. Sophie didn't understand what he was saying, but she could see that he was frightened and seeking comfort. She set down her scraping tool and knelt to his level, taking his small hands in hers. "What's wrong, little one?" she asked gently. "What happened?" Little Wolf continued to speak in Lakota, but his tone was calmer now that he had her attention. Sophie looked around helplessly, wishing she could understand. Then Brave Fox appeared, his expression serious. The other boys were teasing him, Brave Fox explained. They said his new white mother would leave him like his real mother did. They said white people cannot love Indian children. Sophie felt a surge of anger at the cruel words, but she forced herself to remain calm. She pulled Little Wolf closer, speaking softly to him in English while stroking his hair. "I'm not going anywhere, little one. I'm here, and I'm going to stay here. Those boys don't know what they're talking about." Even though he couldn't understand her words, Little Wolf seemed to sense her meaning. He buried his face against her shoulder, his small body gradually relaxing as she held him. Sophie looked up to find the women watching her with new interest. Wise Woman had appeared at the edge of the group. She observed the scene for a long moment, then spoke to the other women in rapid Lakota. Sophie caught the word Maka, which she had learned meant earth or land, but the rest was beyond her understanding. "She says you have the mother's heart." Laughing Water translated quietly. "She says maybe the Great Spirit knows what he is doing." Sophie felt a warm glow in her chest. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was recognition. She had passed the first test, not through her skill with traditional tasks, but through her instinctive response to a child in need. As the afternoon wore on, Sophie continued her work with the buffalo hide. Her hands were raw and bleeding, her back ached terribly, and she was exhausted. But she didn't stop. She had found something here that had been missing from her life in Millbrook. A sense of purpose, of belonging, of being valued for who she was rather than condemned for what she lacked. When the sun began to set, Painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, the women finally put away their tools, Sophie's section of hide was far from perfect, but it was clean and properly prepared. Strong Bear Woman examined her work critically, then nodded with grudging approval. "Not bad for first day," she said in her broken English. "Tomorrow you do better, but today, you showed you can learn. You showed you do not give up. This is good." As Sophie walked back to Laughing Water's teepee, her body aching but her spirit lighter than it had been in months, she realized that she had begun to hope again. Not just for survival, but for something more. A place where she belonged, work that mattered, and, perhaps most importantly, the chance to be the mother she had always dreamed of being. The tests would continue, she knew. There would be more challenges, more skeptics to win over, more skills to master, but for the first time since Jacob's death, Sophie felt truly alive. She was no longer the broken woman Millbrook had cast aside. She was becoming something new, something stronger. She was becoming Lakota. 3 weeks had passed since Sophie's arrival in the Lakota village, and autumn was painting the prairie in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. She had settled into the rhythm of tribal life, her hands growing calloused from hide worker, back strengthening from the constant labor. The women had begun to accept her presence, though some still watched her with wary eyes. Sophie was grinding corn with Silent Moon, a young mother who had become her closest friend among the women. When the first scream shattered the peaceful morning, it came from the teepee of Broken Arrow, a respected warrior whose family lived near the center of the village. Both women dropped their work and ran toward the sound, joining a growing crowd of concerned villagers. Inside the teepee, they found a scene that chilled Sophie's heart. Broken Arrow's youngest son, a boy of perhaps 4 summers called Running Deer, was writhing in agony on his buffalo robe bed. His small body was burning with fever, and angry red spots covered his face and chest. His mother, Gentle Stream, knelt beside him weeping, her hands hovering helplessly over her suffering child. Sophie had seen these symptoms before. During her time in Millbrook, a similar outbreak had swept through the mining camps. The white doctor had called it scarlet fever, and it had killed 3 children before running its course. But here, in the Lakota village with no medical supplies and no knowledge of white man's diseases, it would be devastating. The village medicine man, an ancient figure called Far, arrived and began his ritual examination of the sick child. He chanted and burned sweet grass, calling upon the spirits for guidance. Sophie watched with growing anxiety, knowing that traditional healing methods would be powerless against this particular sickness. Within hours, 2 more children had fallen ill. By evening, 5 families were dealing with sick children, and panic was beginning to spread through the village. The symptoms were always the same: sudden onset of high fever, followed by the characteristic red rash that gave the disease its name. Wise Woman called an emergency council of the tribal elders. Sophie was not invited, but she could hear the heated discussion from Laughing Water's teepee. Voices were raised in fear and anger, and she caught enough words to understand that. Some were blaming her presence for bringing this curse upon the village. Red Hawk Woman says the white woman brought evil spirits. Laughing Water explained quietly when she returned from the council. She says the sickness came with you, and it will not leave until you are gone. Sophie felt her stomach drop. She had finally begun to feel accepted, to believe she might have a future here. Now, through no fault of her own, she was being blamed for a catastrophe that threatened the children she had come to love. That night, as the village settled into an uneasy sleep, punctuated by the cries of sick children, Sophie lay awake wrestling with a terrible decision. She knew things about this disease that could help. In Millbrook, Doc Henley had taught her basic nursing techniques. She knew how to bring down fevers, how to prevent dehydration, how to recognize the warning signs of complications. But if she revealed this knowledge, she would have to explain how she possessed it. She would have to admit that she understood this white man's disease, which would only reinforce the belief that she had brought it to the village. Yet how could she watch children die when she might be able to save them? Morning brought worse news. 3 more children had fallen ill during the night, including Spotted Hawk, the 6-year-old daughter of Strong Bear Woman. The little girl who had been teaching Sophie how to braid her hair was now burning. With fever, her breath coming in short, labored gasps, Sophie could bear it no longer. She went to Black Elk's teepee, where she found him sitting vigil beside Little Wolf, who had developed the telltale fever during the night. The warrior's face was a mask of controlled anguish as he watched his youngest son struggle against the disease. "I can help," Sophie said without preamble. "I know this sickness, in the white settlements. We call it scarlet fever. There are things we can do to help the children, ways to bring down the fever and ease their suffering." Black Elk looked up at her with eyes full of pain and desperate hope. "Tell me," he said simply. Sophie knelt beside Little Wolf's bed, her heart breaking at the sight of the child who had come to trust her so completely. "First, we need to cool the fever. We can use wet cloths, but not too cold. The water should be warm to the touch, and we need to get fluids into them. Small sips of water mixed with a little honey and salt, it will help prevent the weakness that kills." "The medicine man," Black Elk began. "Your medicine man's ways are good for many things," Sophie interrupted gently. "But this is a white man's disease. It came from our settlements, and we have learned ways to fight it. Please, let me help. Let me show the women what to do." Black Elk studied her face for a long moment. "If you are wrong, if the children die, if I do nothing, they will die anyway," Sophie said firmly. "At least this way, they have a chance." The warrior nodded slowly. "Show me." Sophie began with Little Wolf, demonstrating how to prepare the cooling cloths. She showed Black Elk how to test the water temperature, how to place the cloths to bring down fever without shocking the child's system. She mixed a rehydration solution, explaining the importance of getting fluids into the sick children even when they didn't want to drink. As she worked, other parents began to gather. Word spread quickly that the white woman was attempting to heal the children. Some watched with suspicion, others with desperate hope. When Wise Woman arrived and saw Sophie tending to Little Wolf, her face darkened with anger. "What is this?" the matriarch demanded. "Who gave you permission to touch our children with your white woman's magic?" "It's not magic," Sophie said, continuing her ministrations to Little Wolf. "It's knowledge in my world. We have seen this sickness before. Many children died before we learned how to help them. I'm only sharing what we learned. Your people brought this curse," Red Hawk Woman spat, pushing through the crowd. "Now you pretend to cure what you caused. We should drive you from the village before you make it worse. Then do it after the children are well," Sophie said, not looking up from her work. "Banish me, kill me, do whatever you want, but let me help them first. What do you have to lose? Without help, they will die anyway." The brutal honesty of her words silenced the crowd. Everyone could see that the traditional healing methods were failing. The children were getting worse, not better. Some of the younger parents began to look at Sophie with new interest. Gentle Stream, whose son Running Deer had been the first to fall ill, stepped forward. "Show me," she said simply. "Show me how to help my son." What followed was the most intense 3 days of Sophie's life. She moved from teepee to teepee, teaching desperate mothers how to care for their fevered children. She demonstrated the cooling techniques, the rehydration methods, and most importantly, the signs to watch for that indicated a child was in crisis. The work was exhausting. Sophie caught only brief moments of sleep, snatching an hour here and there between visits to sick children. Her dress was constantly damp from the cooling cloths, her hands raw from wringing out wet rags. She had become a one-woman medical corps, fighting a disease that threatened to devastate the village. Some of the women embraced her methods immediately. Silent Moon became her most devoted student, following Sophie from teepee to teepee and learning every technique. Strong Bear Woman, despite her earlier skepticism, applied Sophie's methods to her daughter Spotted Hawk with fierce determination. But others remained hostile. Red Hawk Woman refused to allow Sophie near her sick grandson, claiming that the white woman's touch would make him worse. Gray Wolf Woman, an influential elder, actively worked against Sophie, telling other mothers that they were betraying their ancestors by accepting white healing methods. The division in the village became more pronounced as the crisis deepened. Families were split between those who wanted to try Sophie's methods and those who considered them sacrilege. Arguments broke out at the water-gathering places, and tension crackled through the air like lightning before a storm. On the second night, Sophie was tending to Bright Eagle, the 4-year-old son of a young warrior named Swift Horse, when the child went into convulsions. His small body arched and trembled, his eyes rolling back in his head. His parents screamed in terror, thinking their son was dying. Sophie had seen this before in Millbrook. It was a fever seizure, frightening but not usually fatal if handled correctly. She immediately removed the hot claws and began cooling the child more aggressively, using slightly cooler water than she had before. She turned him on his side to prevent him from choking and spoke calmly to his panicked parents. "It's the fever," she explained as she worked. "When it gets too high too fast, this can happen. We need to bring it down quickly but safely. He's not dying. His body is fighting the sickness." Within minutes, the seizure subsided and Bright Eagle's fever began to drop. The child's breathing eased, and his parents wept with relief. Word of the dramatic recovery spread through the village like wildfire. Even some of Sophie's harshest critics began to reconsider their opposition. But the real test came on the third morning, when little Wolf took a turn for the worse. The little boy who had stolen Sophie's heart was struggling to breathe, his fever spiking despite all her efforts. She knew this was the crisis point. Either the child's body would find the strength to fight off the infection, or he would join the spirits of his ancestors. Sophie didn't leave his side for 18 hours. She constantly adjusted his cooling cloths, forced tiny sips of fluid between his lips, and monitored every change in his breathing. Black Elk sat across from her, his warrior's composure cracking as he watched his youngest child fight for life. "He looks like his mother when she was dying," Black Elk said quietly during the darkest hour before dawn. "That same struggle, that same fever. I could not save her. I cannot lose him too." "You won't," Sophie said fiercely. "He's strong. He's fought this hard for 3 days. His body knows how to heal. We just have to help it." As if responding to her words, little Wolf's breathing suddenly eased. His fever broke, sweat beading on his forehead as his body temperature finally began to drop. He opened his eyes and looked at Sophie with recognition, then whispered a single word in Lakota. "Ina," he said softly. "Mother." Sophie felt tears stream down her face. She had never given birth, but in that moment, she felt every bit a mother. She had fought for this child's life with everything she had, and he had chosen to call her by the most sacred name a child could give. Over the next 2 days, the tide of the epidemic finally turned. Of the 12 children who had fallen ill, 11 survived. Only one, Red Hawk Woman's grandson, died. The loss was tragic, but it could have been so much worse. In similar outbreaks Sophie had witnessed in mining camps, the mortality rate had been closer to half. The village's attitude towards Sophie underwent a dramatic transformation. The mothers whose children she had helped save looked at her with something approaching reverence. Even former skeptics began to seek her advice on minor ailments and injuries. She had proven herself not just as a worker or a caretaker, but as a healer. But perhaps the most significant change came from Wise Woman herself. The tribal matriarch approached Sophie as she was finally allowing herself some rest after the long ordeal. The old woman's face was serious, but there was a new respect in her eyes. "You could have left," Wise Woman said simply. "When the people blamed you for bringing the sickness, you could have walked away. Instead, you stayed and fought for our children. This is not the action of someone seeking only her own benefit." Sophie looked up from the moccasins she was mending. "Where would I go?" she asked. "These children have become my children. This village has become my home. How could I abandon my family?" Wise woman nodded slowly. "You speak truth. A woman's worth is not measured by the children she bears, but by the children she saves. You have shown the heart of a true mother. From this day forward, you are not a guest in our village. You are Heals with Wisdom. You are Lakota." The formal naming ceremony took place that evening. The entire village gathered as Wise Woman announced Sophie's new identity. She was no longer the barren white woman who had been auctioned in a frontier town. She was Heals with Wisdom, a respected member of the Oglala band, a woman whose knowledge and courage had saved lives. As Sophie sat in the circle of firelight, surrounded by the people who had become her family, she felt a profound sense of completion. She had found her purpose, her place, her tribe, the children she had fought to save would grow up calling her aunt, teacher, healer. She would never be their birth mother. But she would be something equally important. She would be the woman who had refused to let them die. Black Elk approached her as the ceremony concluded. In his hands was a beautiful necklace made of silver and turquoise, the kind of jewelry worn by the most respected women of the tribe. "This belonged to Gentle Rain," he said quietly. "She would have wanted you to have it. You have given my children what I could not. You have given them healing. You have given them hope. You have given them a mother's love." Sophie accepted the necklace with trembling hands. It was more than jewelry. It was acceptance, belonging, love. It was everything she had thought lost forever. As the celebration continued around them, Sophie realized that her transformation was complete. She had come to this place as a broken woman with nothing to offer, but love had found a way. Courage had found a way, and she had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from bearing life, but from preserving it. The woman they had once called Barren had become the village's most precious healer, and in saving the children of the Lakota, she had finally found her own salvation. As the first snows began to dust the prairie, Sophie, now known as Heals with Wisdom, found herself occupying a position in the village that she had never dared to dream possible. The children who had recovered from the scarlet fever outbreak followed her everywhere, treating her with the mixture of love and reverence usually reserved for grandmothers. More importantly, the adults had begun to seek her counsel on matters far beyond healing. The transformation became most apparent during the Winter Council, the monthly gathering where important tribal decisions were made. For the first time in the band's history, a woman who had not been born Lakota was invited to sit with the elders. Sophie took her place in the sacred circle, wearing the traditional dress that Moon Shadow, the village's finest seamstress, had created especially for her. The garment was a masterpiece of beadwork and quillwork, each design telling the story of her journey from outcast to beloved tribal member. Chief Red Cloud, the band's leader and Black Elk's uncle, opened the council with words that made Sophie's heart swell with pride. "We gather in the season of the long dark to speak of the future of our people. Among us sits one who was born in a different world, but who has proven her heart beats with Lakota blood. Heals with Wisdom will speak for the children, as is proper for one who has saved so many young lives." The first matter brought before the council concerned the increasing pressure from white settlers moving into traditional hunting grounds. Standing Bear, a respected war leader, spoke of raids on supply trains and skirmishes with cavalry patrols. The debate that followed was heated, with some calling for war and others advocating for negotiation. When Sophie was asked for her opinion, she chose her words carefully. "I have lived in both worlds," she said, her voice steady. Despite the magnitude of speaking before such an assembly, "I have seen the fear that drives white settlers west, and I have felt the love that binds this people to their land. War will bring death to our children, but surrendering our way of life will kill their spirits. Perhaps there is path between these choices." Her words sparked a lengthy discussion about possible diplomatic solutions. Sophie's unique perspective as someone who understood both cultures made her insights invaluable. She could explain the motivations, behind white expansion, while also articulating the spiritual connection the Lakota felt to their ancestral lands. Brave Fox, now fully accepting of his father's choices, had grown into a thoughtful young man who often served as translator when complex concepts needed to be communicated between languages. During one particularly difficult discussion about mining rights, he turned to Sophie and said, "They want to know if all white people think the earth can be owned like a horse or a weapon." "Many do," Sophie replied honestly. "In my former world, land is something to be bought and sold. But some whites understand that the earth is sacred. The challenge is finding those people and helping them speak for their tribes, just as we speak for ours." As winter deepened, Sophie found herself taking on an even more significant role. Young mothers began bringing their children to her, not just for healing, but for education. She had started teaching the older children to read and write English, recognizing that this knowledge would be essential for their survival in a changing world. The lessons took place in Laughing Waters Teepee, which had become an informal school. Sophie used charcoal and strips of birch bark to create the first Lakota alphabet primers, teaching children to write their names in both English and Lakota. She told them stories from books she remembered, but always connected these tales to Lakota values and traditions. Morning Star and Singing Bird, now 13 and fully devoted to their adopted mother, had become her teaching assistants. They helped younger children with their letters while also learning advanced concepts themselves. Sophie had discovered that Morning Star had a gift for languages and could translate complex ideas between Lakota and English with remarkable precision. But perhaps the most significant development of that winter was the gradual change in Sophie's relationship with Black Elk. What had begun as a practical arrangement, a trade for horses and gold, had evolved into something much deeper. They had not spoken of love, but it was evident in 1,000 small gestures. Black Elk would appear at her side during difficult moments, offering silent support when she worked late into the night preparing medicines for sick villagers. She would find warm food waiting for her, left by someone who understood her needs. When bitter winter storms raged across the prairie, he would check the security of her teepee, ensuring she was safe and warm. The change became official during the moon of the popping trees, when the intense cold caused trees to crack with sounds like gunshots. Black Elk appeared at Sophie's teepee just after sunrise, dressed in his finest ceremonial clothing and carrying a beautifully decorated pipe. With him came his 4 children, all similarly attired for a formal occasion. "Heals with wisdom," he said, using her Lakota name with the reverence it had earned. "I come to speak words that have been growing in my heart like flowers in spring soil. Will you hear them?" Sophie emerged from her teepee, her own heart racing with anticipation. She had hoped for this moment, but had not dared to expect it. In the white world she had left behind, a barren woman was considered damaged goods, but here, among the Lakota, she had discovered that worth was measured by actions, not by biology. "I will hear your words," she replied formally, following the traditional protocol for such moments. Black Elk lit the ceremonial pipe and offered smoke to the 4 directions, to the earth and sky. When the ritual was complete, he spoke. "When I first saw you on that platform in the white man's town, I saw a woman broken by the cruelty of those who could not see her true value. I offered horses and gold because I thought my children needed a caretaker, but you have become so much more." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You have become the heart of our family. You have saved our children not once but many times. You have brought healing to our people and wisdom to our councils. You have shown that love is not created by blood, but by choice. Each day you choose to be our mother, our teacher, our healer. Each day you choose to be Lakota." Sophie felt tears gathering in her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her with such reverence, such understanding of who she truly was. "Now I ask you to make another choice," Black Elk continued. "Will you choose to be my wife? Will you stand beside me not as one who is traded for horses, but as an equal partner in all things?" Will you help me lead our family and guide our people through the difficult times that are coming? The proposal was more than an offer of marriage. It was an invitation to become a true leader among the Lakota, to take her place as the female head of one of the band's most respected families. Sophie understood the magnitude of what was being offered. In the white world, she had been nobody. Here, she was being asked to become a queen. Before she could answer, little Wolf stepped forward, at 7 years old. He was still young, but his words carried the wisdom of someone who had faced loss and found love again. Will you be our real mother now? He asked simply, will you stay with us forever? Sophie knelt to his level, taking his small hands in hers. I have been your real mother since the night I first held you when you cried, she said gently. That will never change, no matter what else happens, but yes, if your father will have me, I will stay forever. She turned to Black Elk, her voice steady with conviction. I choose you, I choose this family, I choose this life. In the white world, I was considered worthless because I could not bear children. Here, I have learned that the greatest mothers are not those who give birth, but those who give love. I will be your wife, your partner, your equal. I will help you raise these beautiful children and serve our people with everything I have. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later during the festival of the winter moon. The entire village participated in the celebration, which lasted from sunset to sunrise. Sophie wore a magnificent dress created by the village women working together, each contributing their finest beadwork and quillwork. The garment was a masterpiece that told the story of her transformation, with designs representing her journey from the white world to the Lakota world, from outcast to healer, from barren woman to beloved mother. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Sophie had experienced. There were no stern pronouncements about duty and obedience. Instead, the focus was on partnership, mutual respect, and the joining of two lives to create something stronger than either could achieve alone. Wise woman performed the ritual, her ancient voice carrying across the winter air as she spoke of love that transcends the boundaries of birth and blood. These two come from different worlds, the matriarch intoned, but they have found in each other the missing pieces of their souls. She was a woman without children who became a mother to many. He was a man carrying grief who found joy again. Together, they will show us that love is the strongest magic. Stronger than any medicine, stronger than any weapon. But even as Sophie embraced her new role as Black Elk's wife and the village's respected healer, shadows from her past world were gathering, unknown to the peaceful winter celebration. Events in the white settlements were moving toward a confrontation that would test everything she had built. In Denver, Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford was facing pressure from mining interests and railroad companies to open more Indian land for development. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills had created a new rush of settlers, and the peaceful coexistence that had allowed Sophie to find her place among the Lakota was beginning to fracture. The first sign of trouble came with the arrival of Captain Marcus Donnelly and a troop of cavalry at Fort Collins. Just 50 miles from the Lakota winter camp, Donnelly was a career soldier with a reputation for aggressive tactics against Native Americans. He had been sent with specific orders to pressure tribal leaders into accepting a new treaty that would confine them to a much smaller reservation. But Donnelly's mission was complicated by an unexpected factor. Among his supplies was a newspaper from Millbrook, Colorado, containing a story that would change everything. The headline read, "Local widow kidnapped by savage warriors. Citizens demand military action." The article, written by Jake Miller, the saloon owner who had bid on Sophie at the auction, claimed that she had been forcibly abducted and was being held against her will. It painted a picture of innocent white womanhood in the clutches of brutal savages. Exactly the kind of story that inflamed public opinion and justified military intervention. Miller had his own reasons for fabricating the story. After Sophie's dramatic rescue by Black Elk, he had become a laughingstock in Millbrook. Men joked that he had been outbid by an Indian, and his business had suffered. The false newspaper story was his revenge, but it was also a calculated attempt to bring about the very conflict that would justify seizing Lakota lands. When Donnelly read the article, he saw an opportunity. A rescue mission would give him the excuse he needed to move against the Lakota band. He could claim to be saving an innocent white woman, while actually forcing the tribe into an untenable position. If they fought to keep Sophie, they would be painted as kidnappers and criminals. If they surrendered her, they would lose one of their most valuable members and appear weak to other tribes. The trap was carefully laid. Donnelly sent scouts to locate the Lakota winter camp, then dispatched a messenger under a flag of truce. The message, delivered to Chief Red Cloud, was simple and devastating. Return the white woman Sophia Bennett immediately, or face the consequences of harboring a kidnapped citizen of the United States. When the message was read in council, the reaction was explosive. Some warriors wanted to send the messenger back with a defiant reply. Others argued for negotiation, but Sophie herself was strangely calm. This was always going to happen. She said quietly, "I knew that eventually my two worlds would collide. The question is not whether to fight or surrender. The question is how to protect the people I love while staying true to who I have become." Chief Red Cloud studied her carefully. "What do you counsel heals with wisdom? You know the white soldiers better than we do. What is their true purpose?" Sophie considered the question. "They don't really care about me," she said finally. "I am just an excuse. They want our land, our resources. If they take me back, they will find another reason to attack. If we fight, they will use that as justification for war. But there may be a third way." "Speak," the chief commanded. "What if I go to them willingly, but not as their captive?" Sophie proposed, "What if I go as an ambassador, as a bridge between our peoples? I can speak their language, understand their motivations. Perhaps I can find a way to protect both worlds." The proposal sparked intense debate. Black Elk was adamantly opposed to any plan that would take his wife away from the village. The children were terrified at the thought of losing their mother again. But Sophie's logic was compelling. She was uniquely positioned to serve as a mediator, and her voluntary cooperation might diffuse the immediate crisis. "I am not the same woman who was auctioned in Millbrook," Sophie said firmly. "I am Heals with wisdom, wife of Black Elk, mother to his children, member of this tribe. If I go to the white soldiers, I go as a Lakota woman on a mission to protect her people. I will not stay gone. I will find a way to come home." The decision was made by consensus, as was the Lakota way. Sophie would meet with Captain Donnelly, but she would go as a diplomat, not a victim. She would carry with her the hopes and fears of her adopted people, and she would use every skill she had learned in both worlds to find a path to peace. As she prepared for what might be the most important mission of her life, Sophie reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a broken woman with nothing to offer. Now she was a queen preparing to negotiate for the future of her kingdom. The barren woman had become the mother of a nation, and she would fight for her children with everything she had. The meeting took place at sunrise on neutral ground, a windswept hill halfway between the Lakota camp and Fort Collins. Sophie rode Thunder Walker, now decorated with the ceremonial regalia befitting a tribal diplomat, while Black Elk and a dozen warriors accompanied her as an honor guard. She wore her finest dress, the one created for her wedding, its intricate beadwork catching the early morning light like captured stars. Captain Donnelly waited with 20 mounted soldiers, their brass buttons and polished sabers gleaming in military precision. But when Sophie approached, she could see confusion in the officer's eyes. This was not the cowering victim he had expected to rescue. This was a woman who carried herself with the dignity of royalty, who commanded respect from the very warriors he had been told were her captors. "Mrs. Bennett," Donnelly called out as she drew near. "I am Captain Marcus Donnelly of the United States Cavalry. I have come to escort you back to civilization. You are safe now." Sophie guided Thunder Walker to within speaking distance, but remained mounted. A subtle assertion of her status as an equal negotiator rather than a rescued prisoner. "Captain Donnelly," she replied, her voice carrying the authority she had learned in countless tribal councils. "I am Heels with wisdom, wife of Black Elk, mother to his children, and a respected member of the Oglala Lakota. I have not come to be rescued. I have come to prevent a war." The captain's face flushed with irritation. "Ma'am, you've clearly been confused by your ordeal. These savages have filled your head with their heathen nonsense. You're a white woman, a Christian. Your place is among civilized people. I know exactly who I am," Sophie said firmly. "I was indeed Sophia Bennett, widow of Jacob Bennett, auctioned for debt in Millbrook. But that woman was broken, worthless, despised by her own people for her inability to bear children. The woman who sits before you now has found her true calling. I have saved lives, educated children, and helped guide a people through difficult times. I am valued here in ways I never was in your civilized world." Behind her, Black Elk spoke in rapid Lakota. Brave Fox, now 16 and serving as translator, conveyed his father's words. "Black Elk says to tell you that his wife was not stolen. She was traded for fairly according to your own laws. She chose to stay. She chose to become Lakota. She chose to be his partner in all things. If you try to take her by force, you will face the consequences." Donnelly's hand moved instinctively toward his saber. "Are you threatening? United States soldiers, boy?" "I am translating the words of a man defending his family." Brave Fox replied with dignity beyond his years. "Just as you would defend yours." Sophie saw the tension escalating and quickly intervened. "Captain, may I show you something?" She reached into her parfleche bag and withdrew a collection of items. First came the newspaper clipping that had started this confrontation. She held it up so Donnelly could see. "This article claims I was kidnapped," she said. "But here is the bill of sale from my auction, signed by Judge Augustus Crane himself. Here is the receipt showing payment of my debts. By your own territorial law, I was legally transferred to Black Elk. No crime was committed." She put away the documents and withdrew something else, a small leather journal filled with her handwriting. "This contains the medical records of 12 children I treated during a scarlet fever epidemic. 11 survived because I was here to help them. In your civilized towns, Captain, half those children would have died. Which world is truly more savage?" Donnelly examined the documents reluctantly. The legal paperwork was indeed in order, and the medical records were written in the precise hand of someone with formal education. But he had his orders, and public opinion in the territories was demanding action, Mrs. Bennett, or whatever you call yourself now. You may believe you're happy here, but you don't understand the bigger picture. These people are standing in the way of progress. The railroad is coming. Mining claims are being staked. This land will be settled by white families whether the Indians cooperate or not. You could help negotiate a peaceful transition." Sophie felt a chill of understanding. This had never been about rescuing her. It was about using her as a tool to pressure the Lakota into surrendering their homeland. The false rescue story was just a pretext for the real goal: forcing the tribe to accept an unfavorable treaty. "You want me to betray my family," Sophie said, her voice hardening. "You want me to convince them to give up everything they hold sacred so that miners and railroad barons can get rich. That is not the action of a civilized person, Captain. That is the action of a thief." "Now see here," Donnelly began angrily. "No, you see here," Sophie interrupted, her voice rising with righteous fury. "I lived in your civilized world for 23 years. I was married to a good man who died. Because mine owners cared more about profits than safety, I was auctioned like livestock because your law treats people as property when they can't pay debts. I was called worthless because I couldn't bear children. That is your civilization, Captain. That is your progress." She gestured toward the Lakota warriors behind her. "These people took me in when your people cast me out. They valued my mind, my skills, my heart. They made me a mother. When your world told me I was barren, they made me a leader when your world said I was nothing. You asked me to betray them? I would rather die. Donnelly's patience finally snapped. Then you're a traitor to your own race, he snarled. If you won't come willingly, I have authority to take you by force. And if these warriors interfere, it will be considered an act of war. The soldiers began to spread out, hands moving to their weapons. The Lakota warriors responded by positioning themselves protectively around Sophie. The situation was moments away from violence when Sophie made a decision. That would change everything. Wait, she called out, raising her hand. Captain, you say you have authority. From whom? Show me your orders. Donnelly hesitated, then reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew an official-looking document. Sophie rode closer and read it carefully, her years of working with legal papers in Millbrook serving her well. This order authorizes you to investigate reports of kidnapping, she said slowly. But there has been no kidnapping. I have legal proof that I was sold in a legitimate auction and that my debts were paid. Your investigation should conclude that no crime occurred. That's a technicality, Donnelly protested. It's the law, Sophie said firmly. The same law you claim to represent. But more than that, Captain, I am now a married woman. By the legal doctrines of both our peoples, I am under my husband's protection. To take me against my will and against his would be the real kidnapping. She pulled out one more document, this one bearing official territorial seals. This is a marriage certificate, filed with the territorial government in Denver, according to the Indian Relations Act of 1871. My marriage to Black Elk is legal under United States law. I am Mrs. Black Elk now, not Mrs. Bennett, and I choose to remain with my husband and children. Donnelly stared at the document in disbelief. Sophie's legal preparation had been thorough during the winter. She had worked with a sympathetic territorial clerk to ensure that her new status was officially recognized. She was not just spiritually Lakota, she was legally Lakota under United States law. Furthermore, Sophie continued, pressing her advantage. If you attack this village to seize me illegally, you will be committing an act of war against peaceful people who are harming no one. The newspapers that printed lies about my kidnapping will be very interested to learn the truth. How will it look when they discover that the United States Army attacked a family to steal a man's legal wife? She reached into her bag one final time and withdrew a stack of letters. These are testimonials from territorial officials, doctors, and even some military officers who have had peaceful dealings with this band. They document our efforts to maintain peace, our willingness to trade fairly, our contributions to regional stability. Do you really want to be the man who started a war based on lies? Captain Donnelly found himself in an impossible position. Sophie's legal documentation was airtight, her moral authority was unassailable, and his original justification for the mission had crumbled. But he still had orders from superiors who wanted the Lakota lands. Even if what you say is true, he said desperately, this land is needed for development. These people will have to move eventually. Why not negotiate now and avoid bloodshed later? Sophie looked back at Black Elk, at Brave Fox, at the other warriors who had become her brothers. She thought of the children in the village, of Morning Star and Singing Bird learning to read, of Little Wolf who still called her mother. She thought of Wise Woman and the other elders who had accepted her as family. Because this is our home, she said simply. You don't negotiate away your children's birthright. You don't sell your ancestors' graves for railroad tracks. This land is not just property to us. It is life itself. She straightened in her saddle, every inch the queen she had become. I will make you one offer, Captain. I will. Come to Fort Collins, not as your prisoner, but as an ambassador. I will meet with your commanding officer and explain the true situation. I will help negotiate fair terms for trade and peaceful coexistence, but I will not betray my people, and I will not abandon my family. And if I refuse your offer? Donnelly asked. Sophie smiled, and for the first time, The captain saw not the broken woman from the auction block, but the powerful leader she had become. Then you will ride back to your fort empty-handed, and your superiors will have to explain to Washington why their mission failed. Meanwhile, I will write my own letters to the newspapers, telling the true story of the barren woman who became a queen. Let the people decide which version they believe. The standoff lasted another hour, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Faced with Sophie's legal expertise, moral authority, and political acumen, Captain Donnelly had no choice but to accept her terms. She would visit Fort Collins as a diplomatic representative of the Lakota people, not as a rescued captive. 3 days later, Sophie rode into Fort Collins wearing her finest traditional dress and accompanied by a formal honor guard. Meeting with Colonel James Morrison, Captain Donnelly's superior, was a revelation. Morrison was a career soldier who understood the difference between politics and reality. When presented with Sophie's documentation and her reasoned arguments for peaceful coexistence, he quickly grasped the situation. "Mrs. Black Elk," he said formally, using her chosen name, "it appears that certain parties have misrepresented the facts to serve their own interests. You are clearly here of your own free will, and your legal status is beyond question. I apologize for the misunderstanding." Sophie's diplomatic mission was a complete success. She negotiated a formal peace treaty that guaranteed the Lakota band's hunting rights, while establishing fair trading relationships with nearby settlements. More importantly, she had demonstrated that conflict was not inevitable, that two different peoples could find ways to coexist with mutual respect. When she returned to the village, she was greeted as a conquering hero. Little Wolf ran to her arms, crying tears of joy. Black Elk lifted her from her horse and held her close, whispering words of love and pride. The entire community celebrated the return of their queen. That night, as the celebration fires burned bright across the prairie, Sophie stood with her family and looked up at the endless expanse of stars. She thought about the incredible journey that had brought her here, from a worthless auction block to the halls of power, from a barren woman to the mother of a nation, from the least valued member of one society to the most cherished leader of another. Do you ever regret it? Black Elk asked quietly, following her gaze to the heavens. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had stayed in the white world? Sophie smiled and pulled him closer. I know exactly what my life would have been, she said. Empty, meaningless, forgotten. Here I have found everything I never knew I was looking for. I have found my purpose, my family, my true self. I am no longer the woman they called Barren. I am the woman they call Queen. As if summoned by her words, the children appeared around them. Little Wolf, now 8 years old and proud to call her mother, Brave Fox, preparing for his own manhood ceremonies. Morning Star and Singing Bird, growing into young women who would carry forward the traditions of two worlds. Sophie gathered them all in her arms, her heart full to overflowing. She had started this journey as a woman with nothing to give. She had discovered that the greatest gifts were not those of the body, but those of the heart, love, courage, wisdom, sacrifice. These were the treasures that had transformed her from auction block to throne room. The barren woman had indeed become a queen, and her kingdom would endure as long as love remained stronger than fear, as long as hearts remained open to the possibility of belonging, as long as the human spirit refused to be defeated by the circumstances of birth or the judgments of others. In the end, Sophia Bennett had found what every soul searches for. A place where she was not just accepted, but cherished. A family that chose her as surely as she chose them. A love that transcended every boundary. A home that existed not in any particular place, but in the hearts of those who called her mother, wife, healer, leader, queen.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.